one child policy in China.
Babies, 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 oh, babies, 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 oh, babies.
I'm sorry, I can't sing.
What? But what? Are you saying that my lyrics are wrong? Oh, then you must know the Chinese version of this song, because in the Chinese version, the word babies is censored to be baby. The Chinese version is actually the most prevalent. Most people don't know the original version. Alright, no more jokes. This video is a very serious video about a policy that screwed China's society up. Since 1979, the Chinese government's attitude towards births was,
No, you cannot have babies. You can have a baby.
you think this makes sense?
Apparently, this was the Chinese government's official decision made in 1979 during Deng Xiaoping's leadership, which lasted very long until just last year in 2015, to let each family have only one baby.
The goal of the policy was to curb the population growth. There were about 1 billion people at the time demanding food and resources, which caused inequality and poverty.
Food! I want food! I'm starving to death because everybody's taking my food!
Basically, this is what the government wanted to prevent. And the overall result was most of the people would probably consider negative. Although there were little positive impacts, but they still do not supersede the negative impacts it has made. There were a few positive impacts in economic and social areas, however they are considered very short term, unlike how the negative impacts lasted in very long term.
For example, couples who obeyed the one-child policy were benefited from government's rewards. Families with only one child were treated well by the government with the one-child certificate, entitling them to better childcare, better housing, longer maternity time, and many more benefits over people that had multiple children. Having rewards made a contribution to making a society atmosphere that people are willing to obey the rules, not to get away from the punishments, but for the benefits. Also, while the world had about 60% population growth in the average from 1960 to 2011, China kept its growth less than 40% in the same period. Therefore, people were able to have more resources from themselves than they would without the one-child policy.
Now, the negative impacts. The negative impact unfortunately lasted very long, and many of them are still not resolved until today. It has made impact in all four lenses of political, economic, cultural, and social.
The traditional preference of male over female has caused a gap between the male and female children, which over 100 million girls went missing from the data from before one-child policy was introduced. And this made tens of millions of young men unable to find brides and possibly turned to kidnapping women, sex trafficking, other forms of crime, or social unrest. This soon reversed the old traditional culture of male over female, that female people became more valued, but not in an ideal way. They were only wanted for marriages, not in the modern way of intelligence and workforce. It has caused a syndrome often called little emperors in the younger generation, who have grown an excessive amount of attention from their parents and grandparents. This is thought to be problematic, causing children to be insensible. This soon became a social problem for the government, where people of this generation were being selfish, and it was harder for the government to control them. Another problem with the little emperors was that there were too few of them to support their parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents. I'm pretty sure you have seen this picture of a cake with more and more people at the bottom supporting the few people at the top. One-child policy caused a social problem of very few younger generations people each having to take care of a lot of elderlies. And by the time they became adults, China had less manpower, aka less strong young people than it would have had without the one-child policy. It made abortion more prevalent by leaving only one chance of giving birth, combined with the government's forced abortions. They used ultrasound to distinguish the baby's genders and aborted if the babies were identified female, or aborted anyways if the baby was not there first. Another way of getting rid of the babies was just leaving them. Parents who remarry have been known to abandon their child so they can have a new child with their new spouse. In 1995, the Chinese government reported that there were 40,000 orphans. In 2009, Americans adopted more orphans from China than any other country, totaling 3,001 adoptions. In 2011, the most recent year for which data is available, Americans adopted 2,587 children from China. A total of 24,635 Chinese mainland children were adopted in 2012. 87% were adopted by parents from the mainland, while the remaining 3,311 children were adopted by overseas parents. Around 74% of Chinese mainland children adopted by overseas parents in 2012 were disabled or older children. And the government and the current paramount leader, Xi Jinping, was not dumb enough to ignore all these negative impacts of the policy created 3.5 decades ago. One-child policy was eased since 2014 and ended completely in 2015.
Actually, the policy has still lasted in a modified version after being abolished. This is called a two-child policy, that if the two parents were both an only child, they can have up to 2 babies. Having 3 or more babies is still prohibited, with the same punishments from the one-child policy of forced abortions and inferior rights under the people who have followed the two-child policy. Although it might sound like a progression of people's rights, but it's not. It still hasn't changed that the government is affecting people's very personal lives and very personal decisions. China's one-child policy did both help and hurt China at the same time. Wait, let me correct that. The short-term positive effects came first of slower population growth and more resources for each person. Then soon after, many long-term negative social impacts such as abortions, the inverted cake, countless orphans, and gender imbalance backfired and overall hurt China by outnumbering the positive impacts. One-child policy proved the existing flaw in the political decision made by Deng Xiaoping and the government. And now, Xi Jinping is trying to solve this problem and clean up the mess with this two-child policy. It'll be very interesting to see how Xi Jinping and the future paramount leaders will clean up the mess of one-child policy and its lasting negative impacts.
One child policy in China.